Welcome, State of Events community, to Reimagine Events. This special event series features event professionals from varying sectors of our industry, sharing their stories of how they've had to reimagine events in a pandemic era. As benchmarks are reached for events to make a comeback, these professionals discuss how they have reimagined what our industry might look like. Well, hello, Megan. I am so happy to have you. Thank you so much for lending your time to the podcast today. Thank you for all that you do in our industry to support wedding planners, and I'm so happy to have you here today.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really excited for this conversation. I can't wait to dive in.
I know we have a lot to discuss. This is a three-part series, and so we are talking to three different sectors of the event industry, and you happen to be lending a huge contribution to the wedding industry. And so I am so excited. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, and more specifically, what is the Planner's Vault?
Of course. Do you want the short version or the long version?
The long version, girl. Go ahead. The long version.
Okay. So I have been in the hospitality industry for about 15 years now. I got my start working with Marriott Hotels right out of grad school. I worked in some of the least glamorous jobs when it comes to the event industry, but where I got most of my knowledge and experience and learned the most. I started at the front desk, worked my way into banquet operations. So I was overseeing the setup and breakdown and staffing on the day of for all types of events, everything from large corporate galas to bat mitzvahs to weddings to 50th birthday parties, all of the things. And then I transitioned into the event planning side of things, working at the venue. So as like the venue coordinator, from there, I was in the catering sales side. So then I was then selling and planning the events and passing it off to the person on the day of. Then this is where things head towards weddings. But back in 2010, after about 5 years working for Marriott, I got married myself and kind of felt like I was hitting that place where I was doing the same types of events in the same space with the same menus time and time again. And I was ready for a little bit of a shift. So I reached out to a local wedding planner in my market. I knew of her. I didn't know her very well. And I was applying for a job. So I wanted to join her team and work with her. She got back to me and said, yes, let's meet to discuss opportunities. So we met up for coffee. And I will never forget this moment. It's so burned into my brain that I got there. I had my resume, I had my cover letters, I had client references, and I was ready to interview for this position to work with this wedding planner. And she didn't show up right at first. And it was like 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later. And she blew into the coffee shop, sat down next to me. She put her sunglasses on her head and she looked at me and she said, I am looking to sell my business. I am moving in 4 months and I have 4 weddings on the books between the end of this year and beginning of next year. So I'm looking for someone to basically take over these weddings. Yeah. And
wow. No pressure though. No pressure.
No pressure. And I remember thinking like, dang, this is not what is supposed to happen. I mean, I can't leave my great job with Marriott and take over this existing business that I don't know much about. And honestly, I'm not ready to purchase a business. I didn't even know what that entailed or what that meant. 11 years ago, but I went home to my husband of about 3 weeks, I think at that point, and said, such a bummer. I thought it was a job interview, but she wants someone to purchase her business. And my husband, who I'm still married to 11 years later, happily, mostly happily. I mean, we did just survive a pandemic together. So,
Touche.
Anyway, I went home to him and said, such a bummer. And he said, no, Megan, this is what you are meant to do. We will take out a small business loan. We will figure it out. Like, we will scrape by, but this is what you're meant to do. And we need to take this opportunity.
Can we just stop
And
there
then,
and give it up to the
yes,
partners of our life
yes,
who are like our
yes,
biggest cheerleaders? Hopefully, they are the
I
biggest people
know.
to kind of just scoot you into like, no, this is it. This is what you're
Right.
supposed to do.
Right, especially for those of us that have fear or imposter syndrome or tend to make ourselves smaller than we are. I think having someone in your life, whether it is a significant other or a business partner or a friend or just a mentor, like someone to say, no, you've got this, like take that leap of faith. My husband is absolutely one of those people for me. So yeah, I left my job. We did take out a small business loan. I took over a wedding planning business 11 years ago that the interesting like plot twist to the story is that um, as I started to go out to venues in my market, because remember, I was just working at one venue. I knew my own little circle. I started to go out to other venues and network and introduce myself as the new owner of the business. Unfortunately, I heard a horror story after horror story after horror story after horror story of experiences with the original owner of the business. So it was kind of this uphill battle to rebuild the brand and the reputation and make my way as the face of the business and sort of move past what the past reputation was. It was not instantaneous. It was a several year thing to stop hearing those stories. But I did. And I've been in the industry now for 11 years as the owner of the same business that I purchased back in the day. And there's more to that story later, but about
Right,
3 years
right.
ago, I started a podcast for wedding pros called Weddings for Real. And those conversations with other just industry pros led to doing some consulting and one-on-one coaching with wedding planners, originally starting out like in my own market. I'm based here in North Carolina. And then that led to a membership site in the last, I guess it's been 12 months, called Planner's Fault, which you asked about at the beginning. And I think we'll be talking more about that later.
Yes, we will. We will. Wow, what a journey from just the front desk to all that you, I mean, podcast hosts, obviously own your own business. And now you get to steward the people that come through the Planner's Vault, which obviously is very educationally bound
Yeah.
and anchored in resourcing. It's interesting because obviously weddings have probably, out of all of the social events that we can think of in the event industry, weddings have probably had the most drastic of pivots, transitions due to the pandemic. I mean, this is something that probably I would go so far as to say, and you can chime in on this, but I would go so far as to say that maybe there was like never really a streaming component for weddings. I mean, that just wasn't something that we had to think about. And now, this very intimate, very much, storytelling day has this whole dynamic of people not even being present for that. So can you talk a little bit about just sort of what you've been experiencing as someone who is guiding wedding planners? What are some of the stories about how weddings are in a current pandemic era?
Yeah, it has been an interesting just journey as a planner, the different hats that we have had to adopt and put on during this pandemic, because you're exactly correct. I would say a little over a year ago, the weddings that we were doing, there was no virtual component to it. It was either you attended and you were a guest there in person, or you did not attend. And the only way that you were taking part in the day in that case was through seeing the photos afterwards, or if the couple hopefully had hired a videographer and could share some footage after the fact. So I have definitely seen with our weddings that we have been able to host over this last year, the dynamic shift from large guest counts to much smaller guest counts and having to navigate the technology side of things. Luckily, we have really decided to live in our zone of genius as wedding planners and say we can absolutely plan option B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever that is when it comes to your wedding. And then we will partner with trusted vendors that we know can handle creating a virtual experience and allowing guests to be there through their live streaming. Because I mean, I joke that I have a metal plate and that if I get too close to any sort of technology, like things go awry. So no one wants me handling setting up their live streaming, but as far as providing trusted recommendations and partnering with vendors that do have those capabilities, I definitely have steered couples into doing that versus trying to DIY something that has so many opportunities for things to go awry and for it to be a hard experience for your people that are there in person, as well as the people that are frustrated because they weren't able to make it in the first place and then not be able to tune in.
Right. Right. And in that, what are some of the ways, I know that you probably aren't maybe doing as many active weddings now with all the hats that you wear and you have your own show and all of these kinds of things, but what are some of those huge, like, reimagining components as someone is reimagining their business as a wedding planner or working in the wedding space at all? What are some of, like, maybe just 3 ways that you have noticed professionals in weddings have had to reimagine what their
Mhm.
business is right now?
Well, I think specifically for wedding planners, going back to the hats, I think I've joked for years that our job already was 40% therapist to our couples. I think that as we have navigated this pandemic, wedding planners have really had to get a better grasp, but not just wedding planners, I mean, wedding professionals in general have really had to take a look at their business and acknowledge, and this is a resounding message that I've had throughout the pandemic, is acknowledge what you are able to control and what you are not able to control. So in a lot of the conversations that I've had with event professionals, wedding planners, whatever category they're in, my take on it has been that your conversations with your clients need to be about what your role is and what you can control as that professional on their team. And then there are certain things about the shutdowns within each city and the capabilities and capacities at each venue that you cannot own as your own, like weight heavy on you for every single event that you have, because it will lead to severe anxiety and stress and burnout and overwhelm. So that's something that we as event professionals who are typically people pleasers, right? Like you probably can relate to that as well. And those of you that are listening to it can too. Like we want to own it all, we want to fix it all, we want to have a plan, but there are certain things that are within our control and certain things that are not within our control. So I think that that's the beginning of reimagining your business. We had weddings over the last year that were supposed to be 150, 200 people events that are now at a cap of 20 people. And then we're looking to be able to allow guests from across the world that weren't able to travel in to see the ceremony vows in real time and to be able to see like the toast and the important parts of the day. So virtual is something that we as wedding professionals had to push into our understanding of, and bandwidth when it comes to internet and where the cameras need to be, and does there need to be a gap in between like ceremony time and the toast, or do we need to just rethink the timeline as a whole to fit a virtual component? But yeah, the conversations with clients, I think that that's one of the things that if you're an event professional, I would just put it out there as a whole that those conversations sometimes those can be kind of heavy, and that therapist reimagining role, um, the feelings and frustrations of your clients, they're totally valid, and empathy is a huge skill. But at the end of the day, you have to kind of bring it back to what's in your control and what's outside of your control.
And I think you bring up a great point about this whole contracts and agreements and LORTs and
Mhm.
MOS,
Mhm.
whatever combination of acronym you might choose for an agreement to exist, having to reimagine contracts is huge. I mean, that is a seminar in and of itself, right? So there's putting certain things in there that maybe you've never had to address, as hopefully, listeners are, a combination of, sole proprietors, LLCs, independent contractors. Maybe there's no entity there, but even from that component, like, you need an entity now more than ever.
Right. This is a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of us as event pros, that if you unfortunately encountered situations where your contract wasn't solid, or there were questionable things that maybe you didn't even understand what it meant in your contract, just because we are a year into this pandemic and hopefully coming to a place of seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, that's what this last year has looked like. It doesn't mean that there aren't other things to come in the future that you don't need to be prepared for. So I think it's been a really interesting thing to really hone in on and say, okay, this was hard. What can we learn from this so that we're better prepared in the future?
What can my consultation call look like with a client when we talk about, imagining what their wedding is maybe in a year from now? Can you sort of paint that picture for our listeners so they can have a takeaway of like, okay, here's how I can set up my client for just some realistic expectations to have?
That is a hard question, Sonia. I think that when it
Sorry, no
is, it's
pressure.
really hard, and it's a good question, but it's hard because I think I've been thinking in such small moments of time over the last year, because I remember this time last year, March of last year, my daughter's school's getting canceled and them saying like they'll be back by May. We'll make a decision by May. And I worked in these small little like get me to here and then let me see what comes next, because I didn't want to put too much out to my clients of projecting into the future when it's hard to see, honestly, what a wedding is going to look like next year. But I would say this from a client preparedness and connection standpoint, and just showing up as the expert that I believe all of our clients need. It's important to me when I hop on a consultation call with a client to ask them things like, when you picture the day, what is it that is most important to you? Like, where are the must haves and the not as importance? Because based on what those things are that a client shares with me, I, one, know if I'm the right fit for them as an event professional, if they should be working with me. But when it comes to factoring in the what a wedding looks like coming out of a pandemic, you and I discussed this a little bit offline, and I think that the virtual component of events will definitely be something that carries through for quite some time. But I'm getting the sense from my clients, because we're starting back with weddings here in North Carolina. I'm getting the sense that virtual has been a lot. Like, they've been fully virtual with their work. They've been fully virtual with interacting with friends and family. Some people haven't seen like grandparents or parents in more than a year. So I project that the future of gatherings in 2022 is going to really be back to a main focus of gathering in person, because people have had the last 12 months to really not have that time and to miss it. So I think that the importance of these celebratory events is going to be even greater. I do think we'll see some changes in guest counts. So we have been known to work with couples that are hosting events that are 150 to 250 people. And I think that a lot of people are going to be like, do I need to invite my husband's coworkers so and so to the event? So I think we may see slightly smaller events, but I'm not sure that I see that like all weddings are going to be 50 people or less. I think we'll see the return of larger gatherings because the experience of gathering with people that you love is going to be a high priority. Maybe a little bit less on the materialistic things, which I'm here for, like totally here for. Um, but I think that in-person events with a virtual component to meet the needs of those people that are not able to travel from afar for whatever the reason
Right.
is going to be the new standard.
Perhaps it's a curated streaming experience for those who, for whatever reason, maybe it's that you don't feel comfortable just going to
Mhm.
social events. And even too, for those who we could not invite because of whatever the reason is, now the streaming component is actually an experience so that you don't feel
Mhm.
like you're missing out, because we haven't just plopped a camera up and let you see all the raw footage of people,
Right.
right? But
Right.
it's
Like
actually
people passing in front of the
right, no,
camera.
but it's a
Yes.
curated experience. I mean, I don't know. There's just some ideas of how to reimagine a wedding in the future.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that I know the videographers that we work with are super talented, and I haven't seen it reach that level yet. Like I've definitely seen them go from throwing up one camera and figuring it out to streamlining the process and adding in different angles and then like making suggestions to us as the planner as well as to our clients of like, hey, if we could make this one tweak to how the timeline goes, the virtual streaming guest, this will be much better for them so that you don't have that lag time of just nothing going on during cocktail hour. Or they'll give suggestions for like the couple to come over and interact with those that are there streaming. So I definitely see that shift coming and I love the idea. I mean, I think you use the word experiential, and I believe that that's going to be what we see so much of, whether in person or virtual, come the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022, as to just making an experience.
If I were to reimagine the new normal in a post-pandemic world, what would the food and beverage element at a wedding
Mm.
look like now?
For the time being, buffets are not really a thing anymore. And I honestly could see that going away. Um, we have seen where food stations are still a thing for those people that don't want plated meals, but it is served, like it is served to the guests. There's no guests going up and getting their own food. It is someone served with gloves and a mask and very much like distance between the person and the actual food itself. Beverages too. So having like that beverage service is something that we've had to reimagine. Instead of someone walking up to the bar and waiting in line, we've had to do tableside beverage service or like individual passing of things. Hors d'oeuvres are, there's no more platters, at least for our events. It's individually plated. So if let's say a couple has 4 different hors d'oeuvres, instead of a whole platter of scallops being passed around and a whole platter of whatever the other option is, it's individual plates with all 4 of the hors d'oeuvres on there, and it's passed around to guests. So it's not, I really don't think like all of these changes to food and beverage are not bad things. It's almost more elevating the level of service that guests are seeing at an event. So I think that's kind of cool.
Okay, here's a big one.
Okay.
Reimagining the dancing. Come on. Your face. You're like, oh my gosh.
I know.
Reimagining the dance. Obviously, the
It's
couple gets to
hard.
have theirs, but what does that look like?
Yeah, it's really hard. And that's one of those that I'm curious what will happen over the next year to 18 months, because I had couples postpone multiple times just for the dance floor that they couldn't have. They could have had 50 to 75 people here where I'm located for a dinner, but they couldn't have the dancing and they weren't for it. So, some creative ideas that I know other planners have done is, uh, um, guests can dance at their table, which is not super great, but it's an option. There's been like dance offs. So the tables each get a turn, like going out on the dance floor, and the DJ makes it fun. Like, this is table 6. They've all been together. So it's all like you're with the people that you were quarantining with.
I love
And
that.
you can, yeah,
I
that's
love
kind of
it.
fun. Like, that adds a fun component to it. But for example, as much as I tried to pitch that to it was an April 2020 couple that moved to April 2021 and has since moved to September of 2021. She was not having it. Like, her goal is that by September, we can have at least 50 to 75 people out on the dance floor at the same time. And that's the part that I go back to what I said earlier in this conversation. One of the things that I have said to all of my clients is I am not an infectious disease expert. I am not a lawyer. I am not a licensed therapist, but I am a wedding planner that can certainly plan a great event for you at whatever guest count that you want, at whatever date that you want, based on restrictions that we are allowed to have an event. So that's the other thing, is I don't have a seat in the government and I don't get a say on how many people we can have. So that's why I think I've worked in these smaller moments of time with my clients, because thinking too far ahead and saying, oh, absolutely, by September, you'll totally be able to have 75 people on the dance floor. I would have to eat those words, and I don't want to have to do that. I know that over promising and then having to under deliver on what I promise to my clients goes against one of my company values. And so I would much rather under promise and over deliver in what I know we can have for their event.
That's huge. And that's huge now. That's absolutely huge now. It's almost so much that I did a wedding in October, and I literally every item that I believed was on our, what do you imagine as your dream wedding? I had to go through each item and give them a plan B for each item. Like, we had to reimagine the garter and the bouquet toss.
Yes.
We had to reimagine coming up to the bride and groom to well wish them. I had a long line, and literally I had to put a barrier for people coming up and taking a photo with the bride and groom. So these are the sort of, which I think is helpful. So for our listeners, I think it's very helpful to have here's what I want at my wedding. And here is what your planner can help you to devise as how closely you can get to it looking like you imagined. This just kind of gradually leads us into reimagining income, right? And so not only reimagining income, but I'd also like to actually start with reimagining the wedding budget, because now, you can save on rentals now because you don't have as many seats and tables to rent, but maybe you're actually having to repurpose that budget item to something that I had to think about, which was I had a janitor at the wedding. I've never hired a janitor in my life. Never. Yeah. And I had to really have the reality check of, okay, can we not have a janitor? Are people going to feel like the bathroom is clean before they go in there? This particular, and we actually had this dynamic in my company. We had the employee model, and so I actually would employ certain wedding staff in the context of a wedding, and so we had this dynamic called a wedding steward. And their job is, for all intended purposes, it's janitorial services, but they helped with setup and they helped with the logistics of the room and things of that. And so I hired a wedding steward, and not only did this person pay attention to primarily the bathrooms to make sure that they were cleaned after every use, but also at the microphone, because we had to use microphones. They also had to spray the microphones, right? So this is like a budgetary item I've never had to consider. And so I want to talk a little bit about reimagining your wedding budget. So can you paint a picture, again, for maybe some of the things that you are now seeing on a wedding budget, or encouraging your clients to put on a wedding budget that they've never had to imagine before?
Yeah. I mean, you brought up a really great point about a staff member on site to perhaps check bathrooms and clean the microphones and just kind of keep a general look on the event to make sure that it's creating a space where all of the guests feel safe, right? These people have been likely inside their homes, going out very rarely over the last year. And now they're in this space with people that they haven't been around, and everyone's kind of on that high alert level. So obviously there's that. And then we've had to think about sanitizing stations. There were a few weddings this past fall where there were temperature checks. So we had to, in that one, we actually just built it into our planning fee to add on purchasing the thermometers. I brought on an additional staff member, and it's just a conversation with your client. It's a little bit of a different conversation, I believe, from those that had planned to have a regular wedding and then had a COVID wedding that we had to add on as we went. And those are the ones where you say, listen, I want you to have the safest event possible, and I want your guests to feel welcome and that we've got them. And these are the precautions that we would like to put in place and we suggest to you. There is an additional fee. So for me to bring in 2 additional staff members and to have someone taking temperature checks and having someone then being that steward, as you called it, those are all the things that are additional line items after someone has booked. What we're doing now is for our 2022 bookings, we don't necessarily have like a COVID support package. I'm not listing that out as a line item on our new bookings. We're just building it in to our cost for our packages. And I don't think that there's a right or wrong way to do that. So for us, I look at, okay, if I need to plan ahead and think that typically I would have 3 of us on site at an event, then I like to budget in for 1 additional person. The sanitizing stations, that typically is something that I would have a discussion with my couples of letting them know at the beginning of working with us that I have put a line item in their budget for hand sanitizer, for masks, for I think I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, the thermometers for temperature checks. So I'm having that conversation with them on the front end versus as we get closer and closer to the date.
As we look at a wedding holistically, it's even too, are the catering costs now more because there has to be, right, there has to be more staff. There has to be, I'm seeing all these plexiglass shields coming up. So I'm wondering, like, does that mean, and then of course I believe, I don't believe very quickly that the food component is going, like this to-go component that seems to be very present. I don't think that that's going to go anywhere. I think that we probably we're just forecasting our ideas here, but I think that if we look at all of those different elements, would we be looking at people are having a little bit more inexpensive weddings than they were, and what that all means. And that's why I'm thankful for this kind of topic that I want to cover, because we're talking to 3 different industry professionals to get an idea of, like, what can I expect? What can I expect from all of these sectors? This AV cost was probably a very low overhead on a budget. But now I might have the video, which is actually what in the wedding in October that I had, there was a videographer who was catching a lot of different coverage than, let's say, the live stream was. The live stream is that's another thing that people don't necessarily, I have a production entertainment background, so I understand the implication, right? I get it, right? There's a different component when I'm live streaming versus when I'm capturing content for a video that I want to show my kids, in the future. So there's all of these different, things where it's like, what can I expect?
I know. And when you ask that question in a general sense, I would expect more so than like a budget increase, because I think we'll see a slight one. But I think you should expect that your clients are going to have more questions. Your clients are going to potentially push back on things in your contract because they have experienced friends and family members over the last year that found themselves in really tough situations. Not saying it was the vendor's fault or the client's fault, but that we all just experienced unprecedented situations from contractual standpoint. So that is one of the biggest things that I expect from every client that we book right now, is that I better understand every single clause in my contract and be able to explain to them why it's there, because those are the things that are going to be a shift from 2020 continuing on. Like, I don't see that changing for the next 3 years. I think that we're still going to have more awareness over what couples are committing to and why when they book a vendor.
So I want to transition into talking about reimagining our personal income as business owners and planners
Mhm.
and all of the other, roles that we might play in the wedding industry, a designer, florist, DJ, all of these kinds of things. Can you talk a bit about some of the most significant reimagining that you've had to do as someone who has their own business,
Mhm.
entrepreneurial? Obviously, the planner's vault is it seems like a pivot plan. I don't know yet. I know we'll
Yeah.
get into that,
Yeah.
but what are some of those real conversations you had to have about generating income in this season?
I launched the Planner's Vault in February, the end of February in 2020. And it was about 3 weeks before everything got shut down. When I launched the Planner's Vault, it was designed to be an education, membership, and community for up and coming planners in years 0 to 5 in business. And I had outlined all the content, I had guest speakers lined up. I had planned to help planners grow their businesses intentionally, in the middle of like wherever they were in their journey. But when the pandemic happened, obviously the content that I had planned and the way that I had planned to show up wasn't going to work, because nobody cared about maximizing their Pinterest or showing up properly on social media in March or April of 2020. So that's when things got pretty real for me. The few months from March to, I want to say, September of last year were some of the hardest that I have ever encountered as an entrepreneur, because I was trying to manage the fallout of the pandemic from my own planning business. I was trying to guide 200 wedding planners across the country that were, a lot of them, like in year 0 to year 1 of business, and had left their full-time jobs and had finally taken this leap of faith similar to what I did 11 years ago. And it was it was a lot to just take on emotionally. I was also had 3 small children at home. So I have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. So the balancing act of it all was a lot. I'm very thankful for the Planners Vault and that membership, because financially that was a pivot that helped me take care of my family during a really hard time. My husband is an entrepreneur as well with a startup business. So I was the breadwinner of our business going into the pandemic, as he was in year 1 of his business. And then all of a sudden the safe, secure income from my planning business was just obliterated due to postponements and cancellations. And yeah, so that was my own pivot. The membership is now where I spend 80 to 90% of my time. I've made shifts within my planning business to put people in the right seats to allow my planning business to continue to grow and come back from 2020, while I have found such a passion in helping these planners to think strategically and think outside the box and show up and build relationships, which is like my love language. What I did was I then held some sessions with them and gave them some ideas of, if you are, I'll give you an example, logistically, if you are a logistics person and right now your planning business is suffering some ideas here would be to offer a postponement package to couples that maybe did not have a planner to start with, but are struggling to handle postponing their vendors. They're not sure if they should move their date. They don't even know what to look at when it comes to a contract and whether that looks good to move their date from point A to point B. So putting out content about being able to service those couples that didn't have a planner in the form of a postponement package, whether it's an hourly call, whether it is a couple months that you're helping them out. But then a lot of those led to that couple then saying, you know what, like we've built a relationship with you. When we do have our wedding, we would love to have you help in an event management or month of coordination capacity. I had several planners that started like virtual assistant jobs that were logistics driven as well. So being able to service industry pros that needed some help either growing a new pivot of their own or just digging out while they had their kids at home. So I have several planners now that like do blogging or do Pinterest management or handle social media for those of us that are like, it's too much. I don't want to do it. So those are just a few creative ways that I know other event professionals that are within my membership as well as outside of it have figured out how to bring in money for their family, but still live in their area of like their superpower.
Right. The area that we've honed our skill, right? We've honed
Yeah.
all of this, like you said, depending on where your strength is and where you function best. If you're a logistical freak like I am, I mean, my brain works in systems. And so like, how can you use that to generate income and not necessarily like reinvent a whole new wheel? Because for some of us entrepreneurs, we're all about the pivot. Like I can figure out, and now I make t-shirts, like, whatever, what, you have that kind of brain. But some of them are like, no, this is what I know. This is what I do. How can I lend this gift, this talent to maybe a different industry, but I'm doing how my brain works. I'm utilizing how my brain works. So if I were to want to be a part of this Planners Vault community, what should I be identifying are some of my needs that the Planners Vault can meet so I can understand the membership component?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So the Planners Vault really is, I've geared it towards planners in years 0 to 5 in business. And my goal was to create a community and an education site that did not exist when I started my business 11 years ago. It is the networking component of meeting planners across the country and in a few international locations as well. But it is focused education. So I've really outlined it so that if someone is coming in at year 0 and they need to know how to get an LLC and they need to know how to build a business plan, then they're going to go in one direction within the vault. But then I have it really outlined in 4 different categories. So when they come in, they figure out like, okay, am I at a place where I'm looking to add to my team or create partnerships with venues and have content for them as well? But I think really the community component ended up playing such a bigger role than I thought it would when I launched the business a year ago. And I love that. So there's so many of these planners that I have never hugged and I have never met face to face, yet I intimately know their business in Los Angeles, California, or in New York City. And I know they just booked a client, they just raised their rates. And I think that this community that we have together is probably one of the most valuable components. Yes, there's templates, there's resources, there's webinars, there's industry experts that come in and teach on different topics, but the community and the support system in a pandemic, but also outside of a pandemic, I think is one of the biggest resources. So we open the doors twice a year publicly to the Planners Vault, and then we open the doors twice a year to just a private waiting list. So if you want to hop on the waiting list, you can do that by going to theplannersvault.com. And then you can find me on Instagram at @plannersvault. If you're interested in checking out the podcast, you'll find me there at Weddings for Real. And then my planning business is at A Southern Soiree. So I would love to connect with you on any of those platforms. I'm on social media way too much for sure.
I love it. I don't know how you have the time for that with the 3 kiddos, but
I don't know.
God bless it anyway. Megan, thank you so much for your time. I am so excited for people to hear more about what you are doing, and I am excited to partner with you. So we need to have some follow-up conversations, but don't forget to follow her podcast, fellow podcaster, doing your thing, holding it down in the radio industry.
That's
so
right. That's
thank
right.
you so much for your time today. I am blessed to know you. you, and God bless your business and all that you're doing for our
Oh,
industry.
same. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on.
You've been listening to The State of Events, where event professionals connect. For more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, and Podbean. To engage with us on social media, look for @TSOE Community. That's @TSOE Community. You can also visit our Facebook page, The State of Events. Make sure you stay connected by joining our newsletter. And lastly, we would love to hear from you. If you have topic suggestions, if you want to be a guest on the show, send us an email to inquiries@thestateofevents.com. That's inquiries@thestateofevents.com.